Hi everyone, welcome to WUPIT Pre-Series 2017. Firstly, I'd like to congratulate all 4 teams for making it this far. In opening government, we have IIUM. In opening opposition, we have APU-HELP. In closing government, we have IIUM. And in closing opposition, we have ADMU. I'm honored from Taylor's. I'll be chairing with me is Dr. Chandran of Mr. and Jessica Hussain of ADMU. Alright, just a few housekeeping rules. If you are in the audience, please keep your sharing and viewing to a minimal. If you have a phone, turn it off or keep it on silent. If you have questions, don't ask it unless the speakers are done speaking. Yes. Without further ado, I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to start the debate.
FIFA executives were convicted of taking in millions of dollars to give in the rights towards the 2014 World Cup towards Russia. Drunk in the money that the Russian government given them, they gave that right away and given it to a country that doesn't seem to be able to host the World Cup, or at least is principally right to hold the World Cup. We think that from side opening government, we would tackle this debate in two ways. The first frame, we would try to prove that it's principally wrong for us to give them the right to host the World Cup, given that they bought those rights based on corruption. But secondly, we will argue to you that even if you don't believe that at least the consequences of us giving them the right to host this World Cup is significantly horrible. Therefore, we shouldn't allow them. Note that these two different framings are not contingent upon each other, and opening government needs to only prove one of it to actually win to this debate. We don't need to win on both grounds, right? So let's go to the first argument. Why is it principally wrong for us to give Russia the right to host the 2014 World Cup? So the context here is that we have known that there is an enormous amount of corruption inside FIFA, given by the recent investigations by the FBI and by police all over, Interpol and so on all over the world, right? But what we've gotten from the investigation was that a lot of executives inside FIFA, people such as Sepp Blatter, for instance, Gianolo Haga, who was the representative of the European football, Francois Marcus, these are the people who actually took in money to actually give Russia the rights to hold this World Cup. So we have already proven that a lot of time what happens is it was already convicted in court and these people already taken actions towards, right? But what's important here? We think that because we have already proven as convicted in court that Russia actually bought their way to this World Cup, we don't think it's principally right for us to give them the right to host that World Cup, because the procedure is wrong, right? I think they should be shut off. But secondly, why is this important? Because it creates a precedence that it's okay for you to buy your way into hosting the World Cup, and that's horrible for smaller countries and for people who actually want to host it because of the love for the sport, right? Sit down. Because we think what happens is if FIFA allows Russia to do this, it creates a signal that it's okay for you to implicitly try to influence officials, for instance, implicitly try to get your way in. And that's horrible because of a few reasons. Firstly, because the country that can actually host the World Cup and is actually compatible and actually have accommodation and so on, hospitability, wouldn't be able to get so because smaller countries don't have enough money to actually muscle their way through in trying to win the bid in corruption before that show closing. Do you have anything?
So who do you plan to have host the World Cup, or what mechanism do you plan to do to absent Russia?
Yeah, there's numerous other countries with great stadiums. I can give the United Kingdom, for instance. You can give a lot of other countries. America has a good infrastructure and so on. We don't think that's a problem. There's a lot of other alternatives that will host the World Cup, right? But let's go to the second argument then about how then it entrenches the government inside Russia and why that's wrong. So firstly, a caveat to this argument is we don't think that this debate happens in an absolute. We wouldn't say that just because you don't host the World Cup, you lose the next election inside Russia. But we say there's a correlation. If we can prove to you that we at least decrease some kind of support towards the government or give them pressure, we think it's still right for us to do this. So let's go first argument how this entrenches like the Russian government's position. Firstly, we would posit that we have already known that Russian government is horrible because of a few reasons. Because there's like enormous amounts of human rights violations towards minorities, for instance, inside Russia, because they've invaded Crimea without any kinds of repercussions, because they give a lot of arms towards like Shia rebels who then committed Jewish genocide towards people inside Syria, right? But what's important to note here is that if FIFA allows them to still host the World Cup, what we're trying to do as a football community in the world is that we're being complicit in the actions, because we're saying we don't care that all those things happen. We think you should still host the football cup. And we think that firstly, that's principally wrong, because you're being complicit in those actions. We think a world in which we say no to them, in which we say that because of all of these reasons, we don't think your right to host this World Cup, and we're taking a stance as such is a better world, because actually at least we're being principally right. But secondly, we would actually posit that it gives some terms of it gives to some extent pressure towards the government. Why? Because firstly, we think what happens is that football is something that's inherently like important towards a lot of Russian people, right? They love football a lot. But what happens is all of these Russian peoples are also the silent majority that doesn't necessarily support all of this human rights violation and so on, but they just don't care. The moment you strip away the rights to hold this World Cup, this is where you force conversations on them. This is when they wake up in the morning knowing that they're supposed to actually go to watch a game, they can't, because it was stripped away by FIFA. And the reason why FIFA stripped this away is because of these human rights violations that was committed upon them, because the country was such shit. We think what happens is at least there is a conversation that happens that wouldn't happen in years. And we think what happens is the international community should always be principally around taking our current stance in pressuring the government, and we think we should also pressure them in football and so on. But let's look at the last argument before that show opening. Yeah.
Okay, the US has taken part in huge amount of wars and caused a lot of distress in the Middle East. The UK, through colonialism, is the only reason they amassed money to have these stadiums. Every country in the world has done something wrong. Can you find it a priori good country to host the World Cup?
Yeah, I think like comparatively, like Western democracies such as the United Kingdom and so on are comparatively better than Russia. Therefore, we think that those countries are still decent, right? So we think we can do that. But let's look at the last argument to why it's horrible for us to host the World Cup in Russia, right? Lastly, we think it's really horrible for the minorities who's actually like going to like for the LGBT minorities that's actually going to go into the stadiums and watch games and so on and so forth. We think what happens is it's known that what happens in Russia is that there's that they oppress like the LGBT community in Russia, and they do not allow these people to actually live or to actually like self-actualize and so on. But why is this important? Because we think that given that you're allowing Russia to host the World Cup, a lot of all these people, a lot of like LGBT community and all of these people will actually go to Russia and watch the World Cup. We think it's comparatively better when we host it in a Western, other democratic country that doesn't oppress these people as much. But secondly, why this is important is because we're sending a signal that when Russia, who's not inclusive of the LGBT community, doesn't get to host the World Cup, we're sending that football should be inclusive. That's why we're not allowing Russia to get this right to host the World Cup, right? We're sending a message that FIFA is saying that for footballers and for little kids who want to inspire to be footballers, it's okay for you to be gay and so on. We will not play football at a place that doesn't accept you and your sexuality at the end of the day. And we think that's inherently important because firstly, it's principally right, but secondly, it allows all this allows these people to feel that their sexuality is also compatible with what they love to do, which is playing soccer. I'm very proud to propose.
All right, thank you very much. I'd like to invite the leader of opposition to start the opposition again.
Please.
All right. So I think there's a lot of room to judge this debate on three basic metrics here. First, the ability to achieve your political goals in Russia, the culpability of the participants in FIFA, and lastly, the ability for you to promote organic change within Russia and acceptance of progressive values. Now, to dissect on your possibility of achieving your political goals, it's important to understand the kinds of narratives that are within Russia in status quo. The dominant narrative is that Russia is under siege from the West. The United States and other countries similar to it, these so-called democratic states, are trying to undermine the legitimacy of our government. We believe that we should stand united as Russians against these forms of oppression. I think after understanding this kind of narrative, you come to realize that you make Russian people hate the global community more. You strengthen the narrative that the global community is out to prevent Russia from actively participating in these forms of activities and undermining Russia as a nation. We can see parallels to it. How after Russian athletes were banned from participating in the Olympics, the Russian people screamed treason. I don't think you get Russian people to be more accepting of Western values if you're going to deny Russia the ability to carry out an event with the legitimacy of a nation. Instead, you strengthen the post-Soviet Union rhetoric that Russia's leader Putin is using. Now, rebutting these principles on corruption, we don't believe that, well, corruption is a major issue here. Sure, they got it through corrupt means, but understand that corruption is universally accepted as a negative value and is not something that people will magically achieve via precedent. But more importantly, parallels can be drawn to, let's say, sexual assault in Hollywood. A lot of people went after individuals or actors like Kevin Spacey. But here's the thing, a lot of people that weren't at fault were negatively impacted as well. When you're talking about actors at the top that participate in sexual assault, for example, a lot of people down the chain, meaning people that work for these actors or people that were going to get jobs because of FIFA, for example. These are people that ultimately pay because these are people that are not at fault for the values of their leaders. We don't believe that these people should be held culpable for the crimes of their leaders as well, seeing as they don't necessarily support it. Also on political goals, you see, most countries, it is a symbol, right? FIFA is a symbol of being part of the world in general. But also, you don't actually hurt Russia economically as well. We've seen it in the past, whereby we've tried to use the stick on Russia. We've sanctioned them to oblivion, and we've caused billions of dollars of losses to their economy, and they don't budge. We don't believe FIFA, as a stick, is going to be able to push Russia to adopting any forms of universal values since that you strengthen the rhetoric that Putin is using. Sanctions have hurt Russia in the past, and the wealth of Russia is not in question here. But more importantly, the reason why status quo is unchanging and Russia has adopted this siege mentality, it has been able to forward this siege mentality to its citizens. But the reason why we've not been able to get Russia to change is we've never given them a taste of what it's like to be part of the global community. We've never given them the ability to know how it's like to be part of the global community in the sense whereby a lot of nations come to your country and participate in sport. I believe that giving Russia a taste of how it's like to organize this event is extremely important. Why? Because of the third point, organic change. You see, the ability of people, regardless of nationality, sexual orientation, whatever not, to perform in these sports means that a lot of preconceived notions of these individuals on the ground are things that can be actively fought against. For example, you can strong-arm governments to allow gay athletes or gay footballers to participate in FIFA as well. It's important in the context of Russia, whereby xenophobic narratives are pushed towards the general public. We believe that you best counter xenophobic narratives when you allow these players to participate in these sports. Because of the narratives that are highlighted, for example, Ukrainian players in the esports industry, the tales of Daniel Ishtutin, for example, short form of Dandy, via movies such as True Sight. These are stories that are told of athletes that have overcome obstacles to participate in these sports. Minorities get their stories told under side opposition. Under side government, the stories of these minorities are not things that are being told. Xenophobia is not being fought.
There's 100 other morally non-dubious and not harmful ways to achieve the goals of Russia being part of global community. Like give out scholarships for God's sake. Like why do they need to host FIFA?
Well, sure, but FIFA, regardless, is one of the methods, right? So, like relatively speaking, we rather have more methods of Russia participating in the global community rather than less methods.
Yeah.
But also note that side governments' arguments are arguments against FIFA holding the World Cup. They're not arguments specifically on why Russia shouldn't hold the World Cup, right? Because we believe that if you truly are against bribery, you eliminate FIFA as well. Now, what have I talked about so far? First, dissect the debate based on narratives, right? Understand that Russia is promoting a siege mentality in status quo. It's the reason why Putin gets a lot of support and he enjoys a vast majority of votes in parliament, etc. But they will scream treason the moment you deny them the ability to host these things. You believe that you strengthen Putin's rhetoric, you entrench the leader, you play into his stories if you deny Russia the right to host FIFA. Now, on your political goals, you push Russia away from the global community because they are likely to view it under that siege mentality. You deny them the symbol of the ability of a country to hold something that is legitimate. You undermine their sovereign rights in the eyes of many Russians. Your political goals won't be achieved under your side. Your progressive values won't be forwarded. And this is coming to the third point that I talked about, which is organic change. You make it less likely for the stories of these minorities to be heard. I've gave you examples of how Ukrainian players, when participating in global sport, get their stories told most of the time because of the nature of narratives and the cults of personality that surround these players. You deny players the ability to forward their own narratives. You deny players to tell their stories under side government. For all the reasons, right? Under the metrics of narratives that you push, under the metrics of political goals, and under the metrics of organic change, we win on all fronts. Proud to oppose.
All right, thank you very much. I'd like to invite the DPM to continue the government. Take care.
It doesn't matter what you're going to do to Russia because Russia is not going to change. That is essentially the case coming from side OO. And if really that's the case that they think can win this debate, obviously they're not going to win. Just because you can't create change in its absolute form, that doesn't mean you shouldn't try at all. We think, if anything, that's more reason to try if you think that they are stubborn, more reasons to add in pressure that can be added by the global community, right? So 2 questions I'll answer in today's debate. 1, I'll talk about why through this policy we're able to force not just people in Russia, but the global community in general to care about the corruption that has been long happening in the FIFA in general. And secondly, I'll bring back again the whole argument on the complicity of FIFA when it comes to the corruption that is happening, something that they doesn't really want to engage in today's debate, and I think is very important, right? But before that, I want to deal with the arguments that came from side of the opposition. They have 2 problems in today's motion. They say, number 1, they don't want this policy because now you will make Russian people hate the global community more. 3 responses to that. Number 1, that whole idea itself is very questionable. It is unfair to assume that people in Russia are all monolithic and everyone will hate the global community the moment you don't allow them to host FIFA, right? We think people can react in many ways. For those who are going to hate the global community, understand that this is the sentiment that is going to come from the nationalist Russian, who's going to hate the global community regardless of whatever, because Putin will always find ways to paint the global community as someone who's bad the moment that they try to criticize Putin. But understand that there are also people who are against the corruption that is happening in the Russian government and who like sensibly can understand that the reason why Russia is not allowed to host is because the corruption that is happening in their government, because these people are not blind. And we think in that circumstances, you give these people incentive to actually question their government and talk about it more. And we think that is very much important, given that they are also existing in a world where they're afraid to question those things. They feel like it's hopeless. Therefore, this incentive is necessary for you to get them to question those things. But secondly, right, even if, let's say, we're going to assume that Russian hate is going to be so overpowering, we don't see why this Russian hate argument should be prioritized over the complicity of corruption that is happening, or the complicity in empowering the Russian government that we have already seen from histories and trends that are not very good to the people. So we think we're okay if we have to take some form of Russian hate in the circumstances, right? But we think that Russian hate can also be changed, because in our world, at least, when you allow discussion to spark, that's when you create counter narratives, where you create create a room whereby people are able to more realize why certain things happen, and they don't just blindly hate, the global community, because they are more aware of the plethora of discussion that is going to exist, discussion that comes from many perspectives of views. But second, the problem that they said is that, Russian people are not going to change. And I think I've dealt that in just one opening line, showing to you how that argument cannot even stand today's debate, right? But before I move on to my argument, yes, let's get this out of the way.
Why would a Russian love the global community that denies him the capacity to watch the sport that he loves?
So this debate is not about making Russian people love the global community. This debate it's sufficient for us to prove that at least in our world, they're able to question their government, and they're able to have some form of, basically they are going to like their government less, because they realize the reason why this is happening to their country is because their government are not being effective and are basically indulging themselves in corruption. We think that is still net benefit that we get in our world. So going into my first argument, right, on the whole, how does create better when it's about corruption? We've seen throughout history that corruption has always been an issue in countries and between the FIFA community and all, right? Given that, if we take the characterization to say that, Russian people are separated from the global community, that means currently the global community don't talk as much about the corruption that is happening in Russia, which is obviously a bad problem because you don't have enough voice to discuss, and even the voices inside Russia are sometimes suppressed. That means this is the point in time whereby the people inside that particular country need more discussion to happen. What will this discussion look like? We think, given that FIFA is a very big thing, everyone cares about it, the moment you don't allow them to host, obviously it will create some kind of setbacks. And we think this setbacks is not just going to create discussion within Russia, but also around global community, which is important, because the moment you create more discussion from the surrounding, that's when people cannot avoid from talking about this topic. That's when they have to actually deal with those things, and this is where the government cannot just get away by saying, oh, this is people hating us, because it's not enough for them to counter this discussion just like that. But even then, notice at this point in time, even if, let's say, this benefit doesn't accrue, right? We've already posed to you the first framing of our debate, whereby we're talking about the whole idea, of doing what's right. Understand that this debate has to be about, what is the right thing that you're supposed to do, regardless of the consequences. We've shown to you how the executives that will have. The executives that are involved in the corruption, they have already been prosecuted. This proves that the whole bid in the first place is not one that is legal. We think going down this road means you're going to be complicit, regardless whether you've replaced your executive. We think, going along this road means you're still complicity in the whole corruption. We don't think that is something that FIFA should do. And we don't think as well that FIFA should just remain neutral and say, oh, we don't want to be political about things, especially when they profited from the kind of sufferings that could have happened, right? Even if, let's say, the sufferings don't happen, let's say things do go well, understand that the government is able to wave those things around as an achievement, saying that, look at us bringing a lot of profits into our country. This is you strengthening the government that is already corrupted, that has histories of abusing people on the ground. And we don't think that is something that as a global community or as a global organization should be allowed to do. This premise has never been contested yet in this debate, and we like to see that coming from the opposition bench, right? But even if, right, we think the reason why doing the right thing is even more important is because the consequences that comes with it is also going to be one that is horrible. Because number one, you're going to shape as to what is acceptable, what is not acceptable for the future, right? You're essentially saying that, from that year onwards, when countries want to host FIFA, they basically just have to buy that particular right. This is the moment where you make FIFA something that is very exclusive, only to the countries that is able to buy their ways inside those things. And we don't see how that creates that doesn't really help everyone. At the end of the day, that is not the precedence that we would want to add in today's debate. So essentially, the case coming from side OG is simple. One, we've proven to you why this is not the right thing to do, given that it is very clear-cut. The whole bidding itself is not one that is legal. Even if you punish those, even if, let's say, you've punished the people who are complicit, the essential part of the whole bid is still not one that you should proceed with. And we would rather that they have bid it to otherwise. And understand that circumstances, it is also not our burden to provide those alternatives. We think bidding can still happen in our world. In fact, it's much better, because the bidding that happens afterward, countries are going to be more aware that they should handle their corruptions better, because they don't want to be stripped of their rights too, and they're going to be more aware of what they need to do in order for them to host. And we think just like that into the debate.
All right, thank you very much. To close the opening half, I'd like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
In the last World Cup, when Brazil, a nation that considered football its religion, they interviewed Mr. Luis Gustavo on the ground, where he openly claimed that he believed that the people of different races and different sexualities were always very different from him, and he could never understand their necessities. But when he saw gay men at the bar love and breathe his religion of football, he thought maybe for a second that they're not so different. We think that is the unique example and method in which the language of football is able to break down boundaries and bring people much closer. To answer closing our government's question on why FIFA, we think there is nothing more beautiful than the biggest sporting event of the world, where the whole world puts down everything to watch matches of different nations, when they see different players and they start respecting other individuals. Firstly, let us tackle opening government's case. They say that there was a lot of corruption. We don't say that is not true. We say there are better methods of dealing with this corruption. We think holding the individuals accountable for corruption is correct, and we will continue to do so, and we were very happy for other individuals who have also taken part in the corruption to be held accountable. What are we not okay with? Unnecessary third-party harm. For example, if a company has made huge amounts of money through corruption, we think we hold the shareholders and the directors liable. But it's unfair to hold the workers of the company that never had the power nor the consent to be amalgamated to this corruption. If we can prove to you significant amount of third-party harm, we think that is more to overweigh this sense of direction and principle, right? Why so? Why is it more likely that Nicholas' case is true? Qatar, Brazil, and South Africa, the previous hosts of the World Cup, have all won through dubious methods. When Brazil had riots of people on the ground saying they need more money for schools instead of the World Cup, they still went on to host it. We think what you prove that you are singling out Russia out of every other nation with dubious past and dubious methods of winning the World Cup and saying that you are a specific nation that we want to target. That is why Nicholas's argument is more likely to happen than that of the opening governments, because when you single out Russia, you make it clear that this is an attack on Russian belief, that this is an attack on Russian people. And that is why you need to follow the words of wise Putin, because he's always told you that they were wrong and we were right. That is why we think Nicholas's arguments went unrebutted, because we told you the unique specification of singling out Russia instead of all the other states is incredibly harmful. That being said, I have two key harms to deal with in this speech. Number one of the numerous third-party harms that will happen, and when you plight people into severe amounts of abhorrent situations, we think it's very horrible because they were never consented to these actions. Who are these individuals? Number one, the hundreds and thousands of fans that have already bought tickets to the World Cup. This is not just the rich. The average medium income person has also spent huge amounts of his savings to go and watch this World Cup. He's already booked tickets in hotels. He's already booked his flights. He spent huge amounts of money on it. We think if you agree that football is this is a football debate, right? And in what is most important in a football debate are three key actors. Number one, the fans. Number two, the players. And number three, the host, nation and the bodies, right? We think if we can prove to you third-party harms into all individuals, we will win that clash at the very least. So I tell you, the fans that have wasted huge amounts of money will never be repatriated on their side, and we think that's unfortunate because there was no model on how you would make it back for them. Let's talk about the host nations and unconsenting third parties there. The hiring of subcontractors to build hotels, to better the stadiums, to improve the airport. These are all individuals who would be out of jobs. They have hired huge amounts of people to work for them and now have to lay all of them off within the country of Russia. We think the huge amounts of third-party harm and all that harm will be painted to the Western world. You would have huge amounts of Russians actually believe that the European community and the rest of the world is actually out to get them because you've caused them harms across different levels. But thirdly, also locals who have bought licenses to sell small things outside the stadiums, you hold them accountable as well because their license means nothing to them. But let's lastly talk about the players that have made necessary changes to adapt to the weather conditions within Russia. We think that you suddenly changing, and this is very important in the highest level of sports. Maybe it's hard to understand, but when it's in a cold place, you need to train in a different way. You need to conserve your energy. When it's in a hot place, you need to have different training methods. We think that you don't appreciate the intricacies and nuances of high-level training, and causing them to change severely impacts poorer nations because they have less money and less capital to invest into the better trainings to catch up with rich nations. These are all significant third-party harms that are never dealt with because of some leaders on top having corruption. We told you the solution is to hold those leaders on top, but don't punish the rest of the people. But let me talk about the second thing, on your organic change, right? On how do we have Russians be less xenophobic, or how we have Russians accept homosexuality, right? We think FIFA is a specific body that is able to strong-arm nations and strong-arm sporting bodies within those nations to do things that they please. For example, just in the last World Cup, when Brazil said there will be no sales of alcohol in their stadiums because of rowdiness, Russia strong-armed them. And yeah, this is an example to show how Russia is strong, right? They forced the Brazil government to serve beers at the stadium. Imagine if that power was used for good. When FIFA's banner, every game needs to be say no to racism. If fans are rowdy and oftentimes hurt the players on the ground, are called out, and there'll be games that no fans are allowed to watch. This is when you make racism something that is harmful to the vast majority of people who love football. Because the important thing to note here is the vast majority of the world, even if you three panel don't love football, a lot of people in the world really love football and want to watch their matches. This is when racism will be viewed as far worse. It is because of your racist acts that I cannot go and watch this match, right? But where has this happened before, and why is it more likely to happen again? There are three structural reasons. Sit down. Number one, oftentimes the idolization of players of different backgrounds and different nationalities is very important, and the ability for them to see them, like the nexus is now broken down when they see them in live play, right? So when you have African American players, or you have like players of different nationalities and different sexualities doing amazing things, maybe you consider them as normal human beings as well. Where have we seen this before? Mario Balotelli, a black player within Italy, was always booed during Italy games and in his home games, right? It is after he scored the 2 winning goals against Germany that he's now paraded as the son of Italy. He's the first black player, but he will not be the last because he was able to do that. You only are able to make these sort of changes when you have like the people of different nationality within your country to prove to the people on the ground that they're not very different from you. But secondly, the ability to strong arm officials. Here are 3 things what you're able to do. When you have the saying no to racism banner, when you're able to punish racist fans, when you have Nike's rainbow laces, which is supposed to support LGBT rights and players actually sporting them, that's when people on the ground start seeing this as signaling factors that maybe their views have been wrong all along and maybe they are right. Because the ability for FIFA and the combination of every other sponsor within the area, Adidas, Nike, Coke, Budweiser, these are whole huge corporations and oftentimes are able to set directions in which people's mindsets often change. And they are oftentimes held by very liberal and very politically correct views. You, on the other hand, do not allow these views to permeate into Russian average people's mind. At least we do that.
All right, thank you very much, Diallo. To start the closing half, I'd like to invite the member of government. Here.
My God, I was reminded of Kendall Jenner's advertisement. She handed out Pepsis and changed the world. I just don't buy Mithun's case because it doesn't make any sense. Before I move into the 3 key arguments about the most vulnerable but also the most important stakeholder in sports, which is non-binary athletes. Secondly, about how this is important in terms of the spirits of sportsmanship, and how thirdly, this means repercussions in terms of further forwarding Russia's nationalist agendas. All of those will not just go against their case, but I still feel the need to do some specific responses. First, let's get rid of the ridiculous stuff. People bought tickets, sure, let's compensate them. I don't know where the money is gonna come from. We can make Mubarak pay, for God's sake. It's a moral question that's at stake. We can make tickets transfer if London is hosting it next, or Malaysia, for God's sake. Let's give it to them. If you bought a ticket, Mithun, we're gonna give you tickets for 2 matches. I'm pretty sure you're gonna be happier with that stuff. All that can be done. I think that's out of the debate. Secondly, subcontractors. We don't really care to the extent it's not like my dad who got those subcontracts, but wealthy oligopolies in Russia who benefit anyway, and Putin's friends, let them rather die. I just don't see how the average Russian benefits from a massive stadium being built by a subcontractor who is an oligopoly anyway. To the extent locals do not get business, it's fine. Locals somewhere else get business. I think there are more pertinent questions in the debate. The second thing I think is probably more important, but it's very assumptuous to say that the language of football translates into equal effect everywhere else in the world. My first extension about non-binary individuals will show you the reverse, how it's extremely hard in Russia and sports in general, and specifically when the event takes place, and that's going to be a direct response. So I'll come to that after a while. The third thing they said is, oh, but you see, everyone gets to tell their stories, there are all these corporations, there's idolization of players, and FIFA can strong arm. Ridiculous. FIFA couldn't even strong arm China to be able to send journalists into Chinese rural villages. For God's sake, FIFA doesn't have any political capital. I just don't buy that conclusion to begin with. But secondly, it also assumes that Russia is this country that's secluded from all of the world. Russia is not North Korea. Russia is a very unique case where Russia is fairly open to the rest of the world, but still the project of propaganda is so strong because the culture of strongmanship is exceptionally harmful and exceptionally powerful in Russia. To the extent Mithun doesn't engage with that, which even openly talked about, we think Mithun's case becomes absolutely assumptuous and no better than like Kendall Jenner's advertisement, basically. I'll move into the arguments because they're really, really important. First, how does it affect non-binary athletes and why is this really important? We think this deserves more than the 30 seconds Naufal gave you at the end of his speech. I'll be approaching this from 3 angles. First, let's take the official position. There are literally the most stringent laws against non-binary athletes in Russia, gender minorities and sexual minorities. This is really important because it means even celebrities like Pussy Riot and etc. get routinely harassed and put into jail, and that's like a massive level of harm that literally doesn't exist in any other country. It only proves that Putin as a homophobe is able to unilaterally impose his sanctions and his moral order on the people, and to the extent he's been on power for so long and like subverted democracy in all kinds of ways. We think Russia is a very exceptional one-off and harmful case. Thirdly, to the extent there's active exclusion of sportsmen from the Russian national teams. So we have seen it. They literally exclude sportsmen and do not let them be part of the Olympics contingent or the football team if you belong to the gender or sexual minorities. But fourthly, even the national press jumps into that agenda. The second angle of this argument, therefore, is about how hard it is in sports. And at this point, do you like her or not? I think the experience of Caitlyn Jenner becomes really, really important when she told you how it was really hard for her to express her sexual identity and gender identities when she was in sports, right? It's really hard, and you even see like how these laws play out, right? So, for example, if you transition from male to female, you still have to participate in the male activity. Thirdly, there's an active rejection of non-conventional body types in sport. But fourthly, and everyone agrees with this, to the extent sports still remains the most competitive, superiority complex, and violence-ridden area, it's extremely hard for these people to ever express or succeed in sport. But why is this really important when this event happens? We think there's at least 3 small ways in which harms become exceptionally important. First, to the extent the crowd has been made largely homophobic by Putin's propaganda, it means you simply can't be a sportsman in Russian Olympics and feel included. But secondly, it means the people you are most likely to interact with. So we're talking about officials, we're talking about like people who do physiotherapy, etc. These are also people who are largely antagonistic, right? So these are all the interactions and perceptions. That means it's the most non-exclusive and very different from Brazil, like where even if the president hates like gender and sexual minorities, the auditor doesn't come from the top and there isn't a systemic discrimination against them. I'll move into the second argument, which is really important before that.
If fans in the stands have racist or homophobic chants, FIFA would have games behind closed doors, which is a punishment to them, and the majority of people on the ground hate these rowdy fans. How do you able to achieve any of those?
Yeah, but you don't exclude the fact that Putin still controls all of the activities before the game, and that's where most of the harmful interactions take place anyway. There's no reason why these sportsmen have to go through that. And like, I just want to play in front of everyone if I'm a sportsman. Like, what's the reason I should do that anyway? And I think here's a response I forgot. Like, it was like, oh, like moderates will be really, really angry. Thank you. Like, it's just ridiculous. Like, it just excludes the case that in Russia, like, people don't want Putin to be empowered. Secondly, it ignores the fact that the moderates in Russia are able to distinguish that Russia is very different from Putin's Russia. Therefore, taking the right to host this away from Putin's Russia is not an assault on Russia. And to the extent we're going to talk about the other people, I'm going to talk about like other people who are not that privileged and don't have access to information. It's just made worse. I'll talk about that. But the second argument is really important. See, here's the thing. When Russia was vindicted for doping allegations, what does it mean when we read the news articles? Coaches literally forced sportsmen to take like doping substances. Secondly, even youth teams were seen to be forced into this system where they have to prioritize winning over anything else. Thirdly, even physiotherapists and doctors you trust to build your career force you to do these things. It means Russia has a uniquely subversive culture that goes against the very core of sportsmanship, and that's the second persuasive reason why Russia should not be allowed to hold an event that's the maximum sportsmanship. But finally, in terms of the domestic win Putin gets, see, when Putin gets to like show off Russian dignitaries, it's really harmful because like if my prime minister goes to Russia, she can't really speak up against Russia. She can do that from the comforts of her home. It means when hundreds of dignitaries from all these countries show up in Russia and Putin can rally them as being friendly to Russia, it goes against what we have been trying to prove so far, which is the global community goes against Putin. So that's the first way Putin gains domestic points at home, by gaining more foreign credibility. But secondly, because of everything Mithun says, suddenly Putin is not a horrible person, but Putin is someone who can give the Russians all the forms of entertainment they want. It means Putin becomes even more persuasive and credible. Even if you as an average Russian believe Putin is bad, you still think Putin can be really useful to you. But finally, I'm going to end this this speech with myself in 1998. During the France World Cup, it was the most important thing that happened. I love France to this day. I just don't think millions of kids who will be watching football at the end of the day should look at Russia that way because they simply don't deserve it under Putin. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. To start the closing off case, I'd like to invite the member of opposition. Here.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'll be answering two questions. First, should Russia have the right to host the World Cup, and will gild the principle provided by opening government? But secondly, does stripping Russia of the right to hold the World Cup make it more or less likely to affect change in terms of its political international politics, in terms of human rights and all that? First, should Russia have the right to host the World Cup? There are two principles coming from opening government. First is because they cheated their way through it. If they, to the extent that they used corruption as a means, we don't understand why it's the only reason as to why they got the hosting rights to begin with. We think that FIFA is still relatively based on elections and democratic. We don't understand why the mechanism for that accountability ought to be by stripping them of the rights. I think opening opposition already properly dealt with this when they said we can sue them anyway. But the second thing they said was, well, Russia is an immoral actor. I think opening opposition was right when they claim that all other states have these dubious moral actions. We don't understand why you have to single out Russia. But lastly, on their claim about being complicit, what we would suggest is, if the outcomes of their policy of stripping off Russia away from its rights leads to more human rights violations, then they are complicit under their house for creating the human rights violations to begin with. Which then leads me to the question, should Russia, does this lead to better outcomes ultimately? So first, this will be broken down to two. First, why stripping hosting rights makes the external perception of Russia better. We don't think that no one knows that Russia commits human rights violations, right? The vast majority of the world is already aware that Russia commits human rights violations. We don't understand the added value coming from government side when they say now by condemning them or taking away hosting rights, people will be able to talk about it. But what we would suggest is the point in which you include intertwined sports and politics, the issue of rights in Russia would be obfuscated to FIFA. We think of our vast majority of people right now who are not sympathetic with Russia, but are sympathetic or believe in the fact that sports shouldn't be intertwined with politics. You now obfuscate them because they say that, oh, Russia, we should sympathize with Russia because it's unfair for them to take away the political influence. So we would suggest they're not able to win the external issue under their house because you're able to reduce that vote. But even if they're able to change the external perception of Russia to make it worse, we would say that's not the most important issue, because the most important issue is how Russians perceive Putin, because Russia doesn't really care about its image in the international sphere. But before I move on, sure, opinion.
Just because we have allowed this country to host the World Cup before, that to me is something that's right, and we should continuously do it.
Okay, so now I'll just prove to you why taking away the stripping away the rights would make it worse, and therefore will prove to you why it is then ultimately bad. So what? Coming from opening opposition, they gave a claim that said that we will create this narrative that Russia is besieged. The problem with their case is that they never proved to us why this will be the narrative, the point in which the point in which Russia stripped off its narrative. This is the analysis that was missing coming from them. What we would suggest is Putin and Russia isn't democratic at all, which means that any kinds of media and any kinds of news that comes in will be filtered through the lens of what Putin perceives to be beneficial to him. First, because Putin enjoys a vast majority of popularity. Right now, 81% of Russians support Vladimir Putin. But secondly, because Russia has control of all the media outlets, so Putin has control of all the media outlets like the Russian Times and the Russian Daily that feed the news like Russian people, Russian propaganda. But lastly, because Russia is able to jail and arrest all of the dissidents and all the moderates that they try to talk about so that he's able to consolidate his power. This means that independent of whether or not the news says that Russia is immoral and is evil, the interpretation of the people or the Russian people on the ground would be that the state is being sieged and that the sovereignty and Russian nationalism is being threatened, and that's why they have to rally behind Vladimir Putin. Why will this make it worse? No, thank you. There are two characteristics of the harms they do in nuanced hosting. First, the strongman image of Putin is being threatened. Putin never responds to sticks because his powers derive from him saying that he can stand up against the Western imperialists. To the point in which he succumbs and changes his policies because the West threatened him with stripping off rights and sanctions, would make him look weak and then make him look like he's kowtowing the West. An example of this, for instance, would be when all the economic sanctions we put on Russia, Putin never responded to by succumbing to their rights, but rather aggravated this military aggression and increased his harm. But secondly, the nuance to hosting is your economic situation in Russia becomes incredibly distressed. While preparing for the 2018 elections, they already started building all the stadiums and investing billions of dollars in creating the infrastructure necessary to host the World Cup. Why is this important? It means that Russia has taken billions of dollars in debt and their economy is dependent on whether or not they're able to fulfill the World Cup. We would suggest the point in which the economy of Russia becomes vulnerable and becomes volatile, that's when Putin becomes even more irrational because he needs to deflect the harms to the economy in terms of being able to create this nationalist image. When did we see this? In 2012, 2014, when the economic oil price, like the oil prices went down and Russia's economy, which is based primarily on energy, decreased as well. The way for Russia, like Putin, to shake off his popularity was to invading and annexing Crimea to distract the people on the ground from like the economic situation and focus on a more political situation. We would suggest if you cripple the Russian economy with their policy, you get a more irrational Putin who's more likely to become more aggressive and towards like different parts of the West. But lastly, they say that, well, it doesn't matter if Putin hates Russia or increases anti-Western sentiment of Russia already. We think it does matter because Putin has historically been able to destroy democracies and distort democracies all across the West because he's able to create a narrative that they've like spent propaganda and hacked the servers to allow to destroy the democratic rights of the people on the ground. But secondly, we suggest that if you continue to poke the bear, Russia is going to be forced to be more aggressive and increase its expansionism all across Eastern Europe. We think it's the most important issue because that's when Russia doesn't care about economic sanctions, but cares about him being able to gain his popularity on the ground. How are we able to change that? Note that the burden of opposition is not to prove that we're able to change him, but we'll take it anyway. What we say is, what is inherent to the hosting the Olympics is that we will recognize that it is a way for Putin to increase his image as what closing government wants. But propaganda can only take you so far. It has to somewhat represent the real reality of the people on the ground. Like Putin cannot claim that he protects human rights if it's clear that his laws are not able to do so. What we would suggest is, even to the most minimal extent, Putin starts backtracking on his more oppressive policies. We saw this in the 2014 Sochi Olympics when Putin was condemned for having anti-LGBT laws. But when most people started talking about it, it's when he was able to backtrack these laws and reduce propaganda against the LGBT movement because he saw it as a way to his image. The nuance here is that only one which Russia is not perceived to be fronted as an opportunity coming to Putin to change what he wants to be able to have. Because why if you're out is to change the ranks, you make it a complex alliance, and it becomes more presented Russia. And this is allowing Olympics very proud folks.
Sports is a very unique social activity. It is one that has the possibility of unifying for good, i.e. South African Springboks. But tangentially, it's also one that has the possibility of solidifying and consolidating the despotic government regime. The problem is, though, at the point at which you have a veneer of credibility on the other side of the house, the only way to break that is to instill some form of humiliation onto that credibility. That is the unique contribution closing government brought you. Two issues in my speech then. Firstly, why opposition side props up a despotic regime via credibility? And secondly, why sportsmanship in terms of the inclusion of non-binary people is far better, and we think they should be punished because relative response due to extension coming from Shita. Firstly, let's talk about why the opposition side props up a despotic regime via credibility. Let's look at opening opposition's case and CO's echo at best. Essentially, they are saying that narrative of hate against the global community. So let's just talk like about what happened here so far, right? Because we're essentially saying that you empower Russia because you paint them as a legitimate regime. They are saying you empower anti-Western narrative. How do we then break this deadlock? This is what OG missed out on. We point to the fact that the reason that they are likely to sway towards Putin's anti-Western narrative is because they already believe that Putin is a strongman. That is to say that the root of their problems is literally our solution. How do we then do this? How is Putin able to solidify that credibility? QIUP offers you two very distinct, important reasons. Firstly, he told you that the solidarity and propaganda that Putin is likely to instill upon his people is likely to be one that's directed toward lionizing him as a champion of sportsmanship. In that particular sense, you don't get the humiliation that they want, that we want on the other side of the house, but rather you get the entrenchment of that rule. But also, he told you that like the fact that the foreign dignitaries are likely to be pictured globally in stadiums, implicitly allowing and implicitly permitting that Russia continues the rule, necessarily means that the Putin regime will be propped up. Why is this exceptionally important? Let's look at what CO brought to the table. Firstly, they told you that this distracts Putin because he's likely to focus on political realms to solidify his people. I think the first thing to say here is that it's very contradictory to opening opposition, because essentially they are saying that these sanctions are unlikely to work, but then now they're saying that it's likely to cause a great significant economic dent to the Russian economy. So very contradictory to opening essentially a knife. But second response here, realistically, the FIFA World Cup is not going to dent a very hard, strong Russian economy, which has like a large amount of foreign reserves, like oil that they're willing to sell, and like a decent labor skill base that they can gain economic benefits from. So realistically, I don't think that's necessarily the case that they're going to suddenly focus on political realms or possibility to do so. But thirdly, let's just focus on the long-term prospects of political change under both sides of the house. We are able to weaponize for political opposition to be able to use this as some form of rhetoric, to be able to say that, you were humiliated at the point in which the FIFA World Cup essentially stripped you of your rights. Given that Putin, by their own characterization, relies on that strongman relationship, at the point in which you break that illusion is the only way for them to start questioning that position to begin with. No, thank you, sir. So, why is it exceptionally important? Because recognize that under their side of the house, maybe some Russians stay anti-globalist, but the possibility of humiliating a regime and breaking that rule is there on the outside of the house, i.e. the long-term restructuring of Russia only exists on the outside of the house. Now, let's deal with opening opposition. They then say, our efforts is unlikely to work. Three responses here. Firstly, recognize that previously, Russia relies on foreign intervention as well. But like, they've increasingly rolled back on their foreign intervention. I think it was yesterday that Russia pulled back its forces in Syria. So they can't necessarily rely on those methods, but are now increasingly relying on the economic sanctions that we want outside the house. So, but I think that they also said that like it's unlikely to be very profitable for these people, right? I actually think it's like rather very profitable, because in terms of the ticket sales that are being involved, in terms of the licensing, I think that in those particular cases, it is going to work and it is going to hurt these people to begin with. Opening, yeah.
The Sochi Olympics, where he shook hands with David.
I'm sorry, sir. Could you repeat? Yeah, I didn't hear the first thing.
In the Sochi Olympics, there were a lot of dignitaries there. He shook a lot of hands and took pictures. That didn't change anything, right? But if you humiliate Putin now, you're humiliating the people as well who hate European countries because of this sort of bans, right?
There's a reason after the Sochi Olympics, that's when Russia was increasingly aggravated, because they were able to consolidate their ability to like pander to the fact that there was strongmanship, right? So in those particular circumstances, you lose out as well. Now let's bring back QIUP's extension about sportsmanship and non-binary people. OO's claim was that minorities are able to get their stories forwarded. The first question to ask here is, what stories? Firstly, if it's to convince Russia that presumably they are indeed legitimate people, they already considered that the Russian government is unlikely to portray these people particularly well. But secondly, if perhaps it is to broadcast to the global community that the LGBT people are indeed discriminated upon in Russia, that is to say, the world already knows that the LGBT community is discriminated. So their benefit is incredibly marginal to begin with in terms of these stories. But let's move on to the trade-off then, of literal physical exclusion of these athletes versus being able to tell these stories perhaps. The first response here is that an inherent harm and inherent retrenchment in sports is that there's already increasing discrimination against transgender and LGBT individuals in sports. But secondly, there's also a prevalence of cheating and doping that's perpetrated by Russia itself. The problem here is that hosting this in Russia will presumably entrench that in sports for a long, long time. At the point in which you implicitly claim that Russia is able to do this, that's precisely when you are far less able to retrench from those things to begin with. So the possibility of making sports more inclusive exists on the outside of the house. You have to understand that a homosexual child is only able to feel that he can participate in a global affair on the outside of the house. On their side, they see that the World Cup was hosted in 2015 in Russia, a nation that discriminates against LGBT people and are far less likely to be included to begin with. That is the benefit that we win on the outside of the house. Let's deal with Mithun's POI then. He says that if fans are homophobic, FIFA can then sanction. But I think it's important to never expose these athletes to the homophobic discrimination to begin with, because under their side of the house, they are essentially trading off the long-term possibility of abstract change versus our definite reality of these athletes ensuring they're included in perhaps Nepal's London. I think that is a far, far better world to live in on the other side of the house. We have to understand that the only way to break that illusion of credibility is by humiliating Putin to begin with. Very proud to propose.
Thank you very much. To close the op case in the debate, I'd like to invite the op whip. Kenya.
Two questions. First, is humiliation a good tactic, and therefore will we win the issue on changing Russia better? Second, let's weigh this issue on the harms to gay athletes, gay football players, which they don't need to give any examples, and the harms to the majority of people in the world who will be unable to participate in this competition. Start with the first. We think that there was really barely any response to our claim, except to go back with the assertion that he's a strong man. And because he's a strong man, if you humiliate him, therefore he's going to roll back all his changes. Think about this for a second. If Putin does this, if Putin does everything they say, which is what Ignacio said, about retaliating by, let's say, using the media to, let's say, just make him look stronger, I think that what's going to happen is that the only time when Putin will lose all his reputation, will no longer be able to save any face. He will have to admit that historically he was wrong. Historically, for example, in the social Olympics and whatnot, it was all a mistake. And that every other state out there is better than him, knows better than him. I'm pretty sure that that will be the most irrational and weird kind of action Putin would make, because that would be the end of any kind of like claim on his capacity as an important strongman. So that's a simple response. But let's look at our case even more. Look at the nuances they did not touch on and see why this is actually so important. First thing I would point out is this. I posit it's very easy to do what he's been doing like in the recent years. To simply say that, as simply the media portray, that this new boycott is a boycott that is irrational, and that people who are actually behind the states behind these boycotts aren't even respected by their own population. And this is very believable. He does this in many different issues, for example, when it comes to interventions in different states. And it's more likely this will be believable because it's easy for him to simply show the Facebook posts and social media posts and the outcry of every football player who will be pissed by this. So I'm pretty sure it will not look like he is someone who has been humiliated by the West, but rather that there are other states who are like pandering to the West, but are actually unable to stop them, and that he himself will contain the strongman image by being the resistance against this kind of boycott. It's much more likely, ladies and gentlemen, given the agreed premise that he is a strongman, he will resort to these tactics instead. So that's my first general sub-issue within this first issue. But let's move on then to how people in Russia and everywhere else realistically interpret the communication, the communication strategy. It's weird, right? They assume that all the people in these countries only belong to one discursive structure, which is like this media image of, let's say, let's simply say that Putin sucks. That's very weird. Most of these people who are homophobic, who have homophobic families, who have homophobic churches, will obviously tell them that this kind of boycott is unfair. We think it's a very great, weird assertion for them to make, that once this happens, once this discourse happens, the end point of that discourse is everyone suddenly no longer becoming homophobic. So what's the point then of this? Why is this issue so important? Because given that it's a very small effect of changing the minds of anyone who will matter in this debate, I don't think that it is a worthy trade-off. It is not a good thing to simply just say principally this is correct when the outcome of your boycott simply has very little changes on changing the minds of people to respect human rights better. So if we look at the other harms in this debate, which I'll move on to my next issue, I think then we should take this debate. I'll get to that a bit after therapy.
Okay, you're strawmanning the extension. Our extension was about the processes through which Putin uses this to gain more power. Your extension, on the other hand, is Putin is gonna backlash, like what, nuke the world? That's too extreme.
We're not saying he's gonna nuke the world. We're saying he's going to use the media for his own benefit. I don't think we strawman your extension. We're saying that your extension relies on you disproving the idea that average people in Russia are going to be persuaded by that boycott and see that boycott as Putin as just simply being someone who's wrong and who's weak. Let's start then with the second issue. I think that closing government and opening government assume two fatal things. The first thing they assume is that the harm is just so big for all these athletes who will go to Russia. Name me one soccer athlete who is openly gay. That's the first thing. But most likely, a lot of these people who will go to these competitions, in majority of cases, will probably not care to the same degree. They point out, they gave Caitlyn Jenner as an example. She doesn't even play football. But second of all, if you're worried about, let's say, verbal assault or something like that within that same place, that's the same kind of harm that accrues to every athlete everywhere. Because people who are fans who are awful will jeer you for other reasons outside of you being homosexual. So we think that that's a very mitigable harm. We can actually even mitigate those further through things that we really do in the status quo for any kind of abuse done towards athletes. And look at even the Sochi Olympics. Putin himself said that he would treat them equally. We think the same thing's gonna happen here, right? So I'm pretty sure referees will be fair. There'll be moderators who kick out fans for let's say assault these athletes or whatnot. But let's look at what you cannot mitigate. Let's look at, first of all the people here, right? And I'm sure they give some points on why people love football, but we'll actually be the ones to actually ground this. First, think of it this way. I'm pretty sure that the culture here is something very important, right? For most of these people, it's not just about the money. It's the fact that it's the best show of their lives for the next 4 or 5 years they will see. We know that football fans are willing to bet insane amounts of money just to see, let's say, to bet on their team winning. Their identity is tied to these regional teams or these national teams or whatnot. And so what then is the harm here? If you're worried about homosexuals, for example, feeling like this slanderous effect being in this country, you have to also think of the harm to the identity and the harm to, let's say, like the culture of all these individuals, millions of them who will be denied this important opportunity to go here. But second of all, let's look at, for example, athletes, right, who train years on end, who feel that is the one opportunity in their life where they can feel that they have a legacy and make this life matter. Their only response to this was to say that you could move it somewhere. But then you can't just easily, that still has real harms. It will take years for that to happen, for that to materialize. You have to prepare a brand new kind of bid or something like that, which is why we think that for the most part, a lot of these people are still going to be harmed. All of these harms still exist. And that is something that is not speculative, but it's the change they're trying to say, but it's very real. Let's now look at one last principle in this debate. Is if we assert, right, that because it's the right thing to do, we ought to do this. I think, however, that if you look at it this way, if you look at, for example, how there's very minimal effect to this kind of action, and it's actually going to lead to lots of collateral damage to so much more people. I think that as an action, this does not mean have any much moral relevance. This is akin to, for example, saying that because you're poor in a developing state, just try to sanction a much richer state and not take the kinds of gas or oil you get from Russia. But I think that the harms, ladies and gentlemen, that we've shown you here are really great to them, which is why we're very proud to propose.
Thank you everyone for the debate. Results will be announced after lunch, so you guys can go for lunch right now. Oh, you're gonna